Exclusively to the SABC, the MDC leader Nelson Chamisa says the battle is not over. The MDC has now approached the African Commission for Human and People's Rights, challenging the Constitutional Court's decision that declared Mnangagwa the president. Zimbabweans await President Mnangagwa to appoint a cabinet before the end of the week, before attending the FOCAC summit out in Beijing. Members of Parliament are also expected to be sworn in before the end of the week. All right, well, to unpack that story for us, we're very pleased to be joined in studio by Advocate Pansy Tlakula, who was the former chairperson of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. Tlakula, thank you so much for joining us. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Ma, what did you make of the news that the MDC is now taking their fight, their legal battle to the Banjul Commission?
Well, the first thing to say is that Zimbabwe has ratified the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, so that justifies the MDC taking the matter to the Commission.
Mm-hmm. And do they have any legal ground, the Commission, to overturn the decision that was taken by the Constitutional Court in Zimbabwe?
Well, it's very difficult for me to speculate what the grounds for referral of the case to the Commission are, but it's safe to say that in terms of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, they have a right to take the matter to the Commission, provided that they fulfill the requirements for admission of the case before the African Commission. The requirements are quite clear. It has to be, the case has to be against a state that has ratified the Charter, and in this particular case, Zimbabwe has ratified the Charter. But they also have, that is the MDC, have to convince the Commission that the matter is admissible before the Commission, and there are some requirements for admissibility that are stipulated in the Charter. For instance, they must allege that Zimbabwe has violated one of the rights in the Charter. They must satisfy the Commission that their complaint was lodged with the Commission after they, the MDC, have exhausted internal remedies. And in this particular case, they'll have to prove to the Commission that the remedies were either not available before the Zimbabwean courts, or that the remedies were ineffective. So they still have, taking the matter there, it's one hurdle. They still have to make a case for admissibility of the Commission, of the case before the Commission.
Ma, as a former chair, I mean, talk to us about this. I mean, do you have any knowledge of some of the cases that were taken to the Banjul Commission, maybe even during your time, that have been anything in relation to what the MDC is taking to the Banjul court? And maybe what were some of the outcomes in those?
Well, many cases, you know, the Commission is the oldest organ of the AU, and it has before it more than 800 cases. And after an election, the Commission usually receives complaints of an election that was not conducted in a free and fair manner in terms of the Charter. And we have received such complaints, if I can recall, I think against the DRC and against other countries that I cannot recall. The Commission, as a quasi-judicial body, it makes recommendations and not binding decisions. In some instances, state parties to the Charter do implement the recommendations of the Commission. In some instances, some countries simply just ignore those recommendations.
So what likely scenarios could we see emanating from this case, Advocate?
You see, if one looks at the record of the Zimbabwe before the Commission, and I was a member of the Commission for 12 years until November last year, and there were many cases against Zimbabwe that were dealt with by the Commission in my tenure as a member and as the chairperson. Zimbabwe at the beginning was very responsive. They used to respond to the cases before the Commission, but lately they simply just ignored. Even when the Commission wrote to them to solicit a response from them, they simply just ignored the Commission. So I'm not sure now with this new administration what will transpire, whether they will take the commission seriously or not.
Look, Advocate, maybe now let's look at the MDC Alliance's case. You've got the ZEC totally conceding to some mathematical errors, but then the findings of the court, the Constitutional Court, stating otherwise. And Nelson Chamisa was very adamant that he had solid and concrete proof to prove that the numbers just didn't add up.
I think we need to distinguish the case before the Zimbabwean courts and the case before the African Commission. Before the African Commission, MDC has to make a case that the rights in the Charter were violated. That's really the narrow mandate of the court, that in the way in which the elections were conducted, the rights in the Charter, which will be the right to choose your political officers freely, that right was violated. I don't know which other right will they allege to have been violated, but that's really what the commission will be looking at.
All right. And now, look, there was also speculation that the ZimCon court was actually biased in its ruling, never really taking into account what was being presented before them, and that instead they were actually trying to bully the opposition in court.
Well, one of the rights in the Charter is the right to have a fair hearing and also the right to have an independent judiciary. And they have to link that allegation to the lack of fairness of the trial and also to lack of independence of the judiciary. So as I'm sitting here, I'm speculating. I haven't seen their papers. I don't know what case or allegations they are going to make before the commission.
Looking at the time that it takes to launch, of course, a petition to the Banjul Commission and the resolution of the matter, how much time are we looking at here? I mean, you were saying they have to prove admissibility of this matter first.
It can take up to a year, depending on really the responsiveness of Zimbabwe, because once the commission receives the communication, as we call it, they will then have to write to Zimbabwe and request Zimbabwe to respond. The problem has been there. The Zimbabwe may not respond, and they will have to be back and forth writing between the commission and the Zimbabwe until Zimbabwe responds. After that, the MDC will have to make a full case. Once the case has been declared admissible, then it goes into the merits. Then Zimbabwe will then have to respond to the allegations or the submissions of the MDC on merits. So it's a to and fro that can take anything up to a year.
Wow, interesting there. Thank you so much, advocates, for your sentiments there. That is Advocate Pansy Tlakula, the former chairperson of the Banjul Commission, in studio with us, giving us her take on the MDC Alliance now taking their case to the Banjul Commission. After the break, your sports.